If you've ever crossed the Jacques Cartier Bridge in Montreal, or the Lions Gate in Vancouver, or the Quebec Bridge, you crossed on steel fabricated by Dominion Bridge, a company most Canadians have never heard of, working out of a plant on the Lachine Canal that shaped the country's skyline for over a century. At its peak, they operated 10 plants coast to coast, the largest structural steel company in Canada. They survived the Quebec Bridge collapse that killed 75 workers, survived 2 world wars, the Depression, and the post-Olympics construction drought that emptied their order books. And then, after 116 years of fabricating the steel skeleton of a nation, the company went bankrupt. How does a firm that built the physical structure of modern Canada simply vanish? What happened? Chapter 1. The Mouth of the Canal. The story begins at the edge of a canal, specifically at the mouth of the Lachine Canal, the 14-kilometer waterway that cuts west from the old port of Montreal, skirting the rapids that block the St. Lawrence to every boat and barge that couldn't survive them. By the 1880s, the canal corridor had become the spine of Montreal's industrial ambition. Sawmills lined the upper reaches, flour mills clustered near the locks, and along the flat land that ran beside the water, a ribbon of factories was taking shape. Dominion Wire, Alice Chalmers, Jenkins Brothers. Names that would define Canadian manufacturing for a century, and then, one by one, disappear. It was 1882. The Canadian Pacific Railway was being hammered westward across the continent, and Sir John A. Macdonald's national policy, the sweeping tariff regime imposed 3 years earlier, had just placed a 25% duty on imported fabricated steelwork. The tariff was designed to do exactly what tariffs are designed to do: force the country to build things for itself. And the country was about to need a great deal of building. Thousands of bridges would be required to carry the railway across rivers, gorges, and valleys, from the St. Lawrence to the Pacific. Canada, in 1882, did not have a single company capable of building them in steel. That fact, the gap between what the country needed and what it could produce, is where the story of Dominion Bridge begins. And it begins not with a Canadian, but with an American. A civil engineer from Massachusetts who looked north across the border and saw an entire nation waiting to be built in iron and steel, with nobody yet positioned to do the building. His name was Job Abbott. And the tariff wall that created his opportunity, the 25% duty on imported structural steel, would prove to be one of the great ironies of Canadian industrial history. The same type of protectionist barrier that gave Dominion Bridge its reason to exist would be the same type of barrier whose removal, a century later, would help expose Canadian manufacturing to destruction. But in 1882, none of that was visible. What was visible was the canal, the flat industrial land beside it, the railway running west, and a country that needed someone to build its bridges. Job Abbott intended to be that someone. Chapter 2. The Engineer from Andover. Job Abbott was born on the 23rd of August, 1845, in Andover, Massachusetts, a farmer's son in a town better known for Phillips Academy than for agriculture. He attended Phillips, then Harvard, and emerged with 2 sets of credentials that rarely travel together. He was both a trained civil engineer and a qualified patent lawyer. The combination would prove useful. Abbott understood steel. He also understood contracts. By 1872, at 27, he was already vice president and chief engineer of the Wrought Iron Bridge Company in Canton, Ohio, a firm that built prefabricated iron bridges and shipped them across the American Midwest. Abbott knew the bridge business from the inside: the metallurgy, the fabrication, the logistics of moving heavy structural members by rail to remote construction sites. And he knew that the same business model could work in Canada, where the distances were even greater and the competition was almost non-existent. The first attempt came in 1879, with backing from the Wrought Iron Bridge Company. A group of Canadian and American investors established the Toronto Bridge Company. Abbott became a minor shareholder and consultant. The logic was sound. Canada needed bridges. The tariff had just made it expensive to import them, and Toronto was a growing city. But the execution stumbled. The facilities were limited. Toronto was remote from Montreal, where the railway head offices were clustered, and where the real purchasing decisions were being made. In winter, iron couldn't be imported easily through frozen harbors. First-year sales came to just $60,000. Abbott took over as president and chief engineer. Sales jumped to $206,000 in his first full year, a threefold increase driven by his engineering reputation and his willingness to bid aggressively on every railway contract that moved. But it still wasn't enough. Toronto Bridge was in the wrong city, with the wrong facilities, and too far from the customers who mattered. So Abbott did what a man of his particular combination of ambition and impatience would do. In early 1882, he and a group of Montreal colleagues seized control of Toronto Bridge and decided to start fresh. Not a reorganization. A new company, a new charter, a new location. On the 23rd of September, 1882, the federal government issued a charter for the Dominion Bridge Company Limited, capitalized at $500,000, 5,000 shares. The name itself was a statement. Not Montreal Bridge, not Abbott Steel, Dominion Bridge. The name claimed the entire country. Within months, capitalists from Glasgow and Sheffield had purchased $185,000 in stock, likely in exchange for commitments to supply raw steel from British mills. The British investors technically controlled the company, but their distance from Montreal and their limited understanding of the Canadian construction market meant that effective control remained in Lachine, in the hands of Abbott and the men he'd brought with him from Toronto Bridge. One of those men was Phelps Johnson. Born in Warwick, New York, in 1849, Johnson was a structural engineer who'd followed Abbott from Toronto Bridge and would spend the next 4 decades at Dominion Bridge, rising from engineer to general manager to president, and along the way, inventing the K-truss configuration that would be used in the largest cantilever bridge ever built. But in 1882, Johnson was simply one of Abbott's trusted men, setting up shop on the canal. And the shop needed a home. A bidding war broke out among municipalities eager to land the new company. Lachine won by offering a $10,000 cash grant and 20 years of tax exemption, a municipality competing for industrial jobs by giving away the store, a pattern that would repeat across Canada for the next century and beyond. Abbott accepted. The Lachine yards began to take shape on flat industrial land along the canal, within sight of the CPR main line. Abbott's compensation told you everything about the man. His salary was $5,000 a year, respectable, but not extravagant. His real incentive was a 10% commission on all company business. Every contract Dominion Bridge won put money directly in Abbott's pocket. He was financially wired to win every bid, chase every opportunity, and push the young company into every corner of the country's construction market. The yards rose quickly, fabricating bays, iron shops, rail sidings connecting to the CPR line. The sound of the first rivets driven in the new facility carried across the canal water, a sound that would echo from that 12-hectare rectangle of industrial land for the next 115 years. An American engineer, Scottish and English capital, a federal charter, and a municipality willing to hand over cash and tax breaks to get the jobs. Dominion Bridge was, from its first day, a product of the forces that built industrial Canada. Ambition from the South, money from across the Atlantic, and a country willing to pay whatever it took to turn itself from a colonial resource economy into something that could fabricate its own steel. Chapter 3. Steel across the Dominion. The first major contract came in 1883, an unequal arm cantilever bridge over the reversing falls at St. John, New Brunswick, one of Canada's earliest steel cantilever designs, engineered for the violent tidal waters that reversed direction twice a day where the St. John River met the Bay of Fundy. It was a test. The railway companies wanted to know if this new Lachine outfit could build to specification, deliver on schedule, and handle the kind of site conditions that broke lesser firms. Abbott's team passed. Then came the contract that changed everything. In 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway needed a bridge over the St. Lawrence at Lachine itself, a 3,400-foot structure to replace the wooden trestles that had been carrying traffic on faith and prayer. Dominion Bridge won the bid and delivered a steel span that established the company as the CPR's go-to fabricator. The relationship between Dominion Bridge and the Canadian Pacific Railway, the company that was literally stitching the country together, would anchor Dominion Bridge's order book for decades. But the contract that would echo longest came in 1886, and it began with an assumption that turned out to be spectacularly wrong. The CPR needed a cantilevered bridge across the St. Lawrence from Lachine to the South Shore. Part of the bridge route crossed Kahnawake Mohawk Reservation land, and the Mohawks made their position clear. If the bridge was going through their territory, their men were going to work on it. Dominion Bridge agreed, assuming, as a company official later admitted, that the Mohawks would unload boxcars and haul materials, manual labor, ground-level work. Instead, the Kahnawake men climbed directly into the spans. They walked the high steel as though they'd been born on it, moving across beams and girders with a physical confidence that startled the experienced ironworkers already on the job. A Dominion Bridge official, quoted decades later in a 1949 New Yorker piece by the journalist Joseph Mitchell, recalled it plainly. They walked around up there, as cool and collected as the toughest of our riveters. Another official put it more vividly. Putting riveting tools in their hands, he said, was like putting ham with eggs. By the end of the project, 70 Kahnawake men had been trained as iron workers. And from that single bridge contract, a job that Dominion Bridge's management had expected would produce nothing more than laborers, an entire tradition was born. Kahnawake Mohawk ironworkers went on to build the Empire State Building, the George Washington Bridge, the World Trade Center. They worked the highest steel on the most dangerous jobs in North America, and the tradition that began on a Dominion Bridge project in 1886 continues today. Mohawk ironworkers helped build the new Champlain Bridge in Montreal. Their tradition outlasted the company that started it by decades. Dominion Bridge, for its part, kept growing. In 1890, James Ross, a civil engineer with deep railway connections, replaced Abbott as president. Abbott returned to Massachusetts, where he died in 1896 at the age of 50. He was 50 years old. The company he'd founded was 14. It would outlive him by more than a century, but not by much. The man who would define Dominion Bridge's engineering ambitions arrived in 1886, the same year as the Kahnawake Revelation. George Herrick Duggan, born in Toronto in 1862, educated at Upper Canada College and the University of Toronto, joined the engineering department and rose to chief engineer by 1901. Duggan was a Renaissance figure by any standard. During the week, he designed the largest bridges in the country. On weekends, he designed championship yachts, earning the title Dean of Canadian Yachting and 3 honorary doctorates. He held a Royal Humane Society Medal, awarded in 1893 for a rescue whose details the records don't preserve, but whose recognition suggests physical courage to match the intellectual kind. Duggan would lead Dominion Bridge as president from 1919 to 1936 and as chairman until 1946, 6 decades of association with the company. Under Duggan, Johnson, and their successors, Dominion Bridge expanded across the country. Branch plants opened in Amherst, Nova Scotia, in Ottawa, in Winnipeg, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver. By 1934, the combined plants had an annual capacity of 200,000 tons of bridge and structural steel work, a volume that made Dominion Bridge not just the largest structural steel fabricator in Canada, but the dominant presence in the market, the company that competitors measured themselves against and usually came up short. In 1898, Duggan's engineering department won the contract to design and build the Alexandra Bridge in Ottawa. When it was completed in 1901, it was the 4th longest cantilever span in the world, designed and built entirely by Canadian engineers at a time when most major structural works in the country were still being designed by foreign firms. The Alexandra Bridge still stands. It still connects Ottawa to Gatineau. And it was built by men working out of a fabricating shop on a canal in Lachine. The subsidiary companies followed. National Bridge Company of Canada in 1910. A controlling interest in Riverside Ironworks in 1928. A joint venture with American Hoist and Derrick to form Dominion Hoist and Shovel in 1931. Each acquisition extended the company's reach, not just in structural steel, but in the broader ecosystem of heavy engineering that Canada's infrastructure demanded. Dominion Bridge wasn't simply building bridges anymore. It was building the capacity to build the country. Chapter 4. The Cathedral of Iron. At its peak, the Lachine plant sprawled across 12 hectares of flat industrial land divided by Boulevard Saint-Joseph, the original road that connected Montreal to points west, now running through the middle of a steel fabrication complex that had been growing since 1883. 15 to 20 buildings, erected over 6 decades, lined both sides of the boulevard. The oldest dated from the year of founding. The newest went up during the Second World War. Together, they formed something that anyone who worked there would have recognized as a particular kind of industrial landscape. Not a single building with a single purpose, but a small city organized around the transformation of raw steel into the structural bones of a nation. The workflow began at the canal. Raw steel arrived by rail along the waterway, plate, angles, channels, beams, and was shunted onto sidings that ran directly into the fabricating shops. Inside, the steel was cut, shaped, drilled, and prepared for assembly. The cutting alone was a spectacle. Oxyacetylene torches carving through plate steel with a sound like tearing fabric. The blue-white flame leaving a molten edge that glowed orange as it cooled. Overhead, the massive traveling crane, the pont roulant, as the French-speaking workers called it, ran on rails above the fabricating floor. Its operator perched in a cab 40 feet above the ground, lifting multi-ton steel members from station to station with the precision of a surgeon moving instruments. That crane would outlast the company. It stands today, preserved in the landscape plan of the eco-district that's replacing the factory. A skeletal monument, painted and maintained, lifting nothing. Below the crane, the riveting. Pneumatic riveting guns had replaced hand-driven rivets by the early 20th century, but the noise was, if anything, worse. A Dominion Bridge official, quoted in Joseph Mitchell's 1949 New Yorker piece, described the sound with clinical accuracy. It goes right through you and is often enough in itself to make newcomers to construction feel sick and dizzy. The riveting guns didn't just make noise, they made a physical impact, a percussive shock that you felt in your chest and your teeth before you registered it as sound. Workers who spent decades on the riveting floor carried the hearing damage as a mark of the trade, the same way coal miners carried dust in their lungs. George Herrick Duggan, ever the innovator, pushed Dominion Bridge toward electric arc welding as a complement to riveting, pioneering electric welded steel assembly in the company's fabricating shops at a time when most structural steel firms still relied entirely on rivets. The blue-white flash of the arc welder joined the orange glow of the cutting torches and the staccato crash of the riveting guns to create the particular visual signature of the Lachine plant at work, a constantly shifting light show of industrial production that played across the walls of the fabricating bays from the start of the morning shift to the end of the afternoon. And then there were the Canadian conditions. The Lachine plant sat on the St. Lawrence floodplain. Spring brought meltwater and ice jams that could push water across the lower yards. Winter brought temperatures that made steel brittle and hands numb. Metal so cold it burned bare skin on contact. Workers in January handled structural steel wearing heavy gloves that reduced their dexterity, working more slowly and more carefully than they would in summer, knowing that a moment's carelessness with frozen steel could mean a lost fingertip or worse. The contrast between the freezing yards outside and the relative warmth of the fabricating shops, heated by the forges, the welding arcs, and the sheer friction of industrial activity, was something every Lachine worker knew in their bones. You stepped through the shop door on a February morning, and the temperature difference hit you like walking into another country. The products that left the Lachine floor carried a particular smell with them, the composite scent of a steel fabrication plant, hot metal, welding flux, machine oil, and underneath it all, the iron blood smell of freshly cut steel, a mineral sharpness that got into your clothes and your hair and stayed there. Workers' families knew the smell. It came home with them on the bus, on the drive, on the walk up the front steps. The smell of the Lachine plant was the smell of the paycheck, and nobody who grew up in a Dominion Bridge household ever forgot it. Dugan's ambitions extended beyond structural steel. In 1920, he established Dominion Engineering Works as a subsidiary, manufacturing paper machines and hydraulic turbines that achieved record-breaking performances. The turbines went to the Bay of Fundy tidal power plant and to Tarbela in Pakistan. The paper machines served pulp and paper mills across Canada. Dominion Engineering Works was a diversification that actually worked, a bet on Canadian heavy engineering expertise that paid off for decades. It was eventually sold to Canadian General Electric in 1962. But for 40 years, it demonstrated that the skills honed on the Lachine floor could be applied to industries far beyond bridges and buildings. Philip Louis Prattley joined Dominion Bridge as a design engineer and became one of the foremost bridge designers in Canadian history. Prattley would design the Jacques Cartier Bridge and the Lions Gate Bridge, two structures that define the skylines of Montreal and Vancouver, respectively. In 2005, he was designated a person of national historic significance. The bridges he designed carry millions of vehicles a year. The company he designed them for no longer exists. And then there were the families. At the Burnaby plant in British Columbia, one father and son pair combined 80 years of service. The father began work in the 1930s. The son started in the mid-50s. Between them, they fabricated steel trusses across 4 decades of Canadian infrastructure, bridges, buildings, industrial structures, working side by side on the same fabricating floor for years before the father retired and the son carried on alone. 80 combined years. 2 lives measured in steel and rivets and the daily rhythm of a plant that ran 6 days a week. That kind of continuity, fathers and sons, decades of accumulated skill passed from one set of hands to the next, was what made Dominion Bridge more than a company. It was an institution. And institutions, as the workers on the Lachine floor would eventually learn, can be dismantled far more quickly than they can be built. Chapter 5. The company that built Canada. The roll call of Dominion Bridge structures reads like a tour of the country's physical infrastructure, and the temptation is to list them. Bridge after bridge, building after building, the accumulated evidence of a century of fabrication. But lists are for archives. What matters is what these structures meant, and what it meant that a single company, working out of plants from Amherst to Burnaby, fabricated the steel for nearly all of them. Start with the Quebec Bridge. It was intended to be the world's longest cantilever span, crossing the St. Lawrence downstream from Quebec City. Dominion Bridge's joint venture, the St. Lawrence Bridge Company, led by Phelps Johnson, took on the construction. On the 29th of August, 1907, at 5:35 in the afternoon, the south arm collapsed into the river in 15 seconds. 75 workers were killed. 33 of them were Kanawake Mohawk iron workers, the same community that had walked the high steel on the 1886 bridge at Lachine, the men whose skill had been born on a Dominion Bridge project just 21 years earlier. It was the worst construction disaster in the history of Canadian bridge building, and the Kanawake community's response was not retreat. It was dispersal. The Mohawk women, the mothers, the wives, the sisters of the dead, insisted that their men would never again work a single job in concentrated numbers. The riveting gang spread out across the continent. Kanawake ironworkers went on to build the Empire State Building, the George Washington Bridge, and the World Trade Center. The catastrophe didn't end the tradition. It scattered it, and in scattering it, made it permanent. The second attempt to complete the Quebec Bridge ended in further tragedy. On the 11th of September, 1916, the center span fell during hoisting. 13 more workers died. But Dominion Bridge came back a third time. George Herrick Dugan served as chief engineer of the St. Lawrence Bridge Company for the successful completion in 1917. Phelps Johnson's K-truss design, the configuration he'd invented, was the structural system that held. The Quebec Bridge still stands. It still carries rail traffic. In 2015, it was listed as one of Canada's 10 most endangered historic sites, not because it's failing, but because the country hasn't invested enough to preserve what its engineers achieved more than a century ago. The Jacques Cartier Bridge followed in 1929. Philip Prattley's design, fabricated at Lachine, completed 17 months ahead of schedule. 17 months early, on the largest bridge project in Canada at the time. That kind of execution doesn't happen by accident. It happens when an engineering organization has spent decades accumulating the institutional knowledge, the skilled workforce, and the production capacity to deliver what it promises. Then, the Honoré-Mercier Bridge in 1934, a Depression-era government works program that kept the Lachine plant running when private construction had dried up. The Lions Gate Bridge in Vancouver, Prattley again, the suspension bridge that still spans the Narrows. The Marine Building in Vancouver, 1930. The Fairmont Hotel, Vancouver, 1939. Windsor Station in Montreal, 1889. The Lumsden Building in Toronto. The Royal Trust Tower. And then, in 1957, something that sounds impossible until you understand the engineering. Dominion Bridge jacked up the Jacques Cartier Bridge. The entire structure. Raised it from 40 feet of clearance to 120 feet, 80 additional feet of height, to allow ships of the new St. Lawrence Seaway to pass beneath it. They did the same to the Honoré-Mercier Bridge. Both operations were performed while the bridges remained in service. Thousands of vehicles crossed the Jacques Cartier Bridge every day while Dominion Bridge engineers lifted the deck beneath them. The Seaway opened in 1959. The bridges have been at their new height ever since. By the 1960s, Dominion Bridge operated plants from coast to coast: Lachine, Amherst, Toronto, Winnipeg, Regina, Saskatoon, Calgary, Edmonton, Richmond, and Burnaby. 10 plants, thousands of workers. Canada's largest structural steel company and its largest steel distributor. If you lived in a Canadian city, you lived inside Dominion Bridge's work. You crossed their bridges on the way to the office. You worked in buildings held up by their steel. You watched hockey in arenas they'd framed. The company was invisible in the way that infrastructure is always invisible, so fundamental to the built environment that nobody thought to notice it, the way nobody thinks to notice the skeleton inside their own body. That invisibility would prove to be part of the tragedy. When the company was dismantled, there would be no public outcry, because most Canadians had never heard the name. They just crossed the bridges. Chapter 6. The Last Great Project. Expo 67 arrived in Montreal like a declaration of national confidence. The World's Fair of 1967, Canada's centennial year, drew 50 million visitors to a series of pavilions built on islands in the St. Lawrence. It was, by most accounts, the most successful World's Fair of the 20th century, and Montreal was at the center of it. Dominion Bridge fabricated steel for pavilions, including the German pavilion. They built the Pont de la Concorde in 1965, the bridge connecting the expo site to the city. The Lachine plant was busy. The order book was full. Montreal was building, and Dominion Bridge was building Montreal. Then came the 1976 Olympics, the last great wave of construction work for the company's Canadian operations. Roger Taillebert's futuristic Olympic Stadium, a concrete and steel vision that would saddle Montreal with debt until 2006, required structural steel fabrication on a massive scale. Dominion Bridge provided it. Labor strikes, cost overruns, political chaos. None of it stopped the steel from arriving. The Lachine plant delivered. But here is the detail that matters, the one that changes the shape of the story. At the very moment the Lachine plant was fabricating steel for Montreal's greatest spectacle, the Burnaby plant, the British Columbia operation, where a father and son had combined 80 years of service, was already shut down. Closed in the mid-1970s. The coast-to-coast network was shrinking even as the Montreal operations were at their busiest. The peak and the beginning of the end overlapped, and almost nobody noticed. The company's sales in 1970 stood at $168 million. Algoma Steel held a 43% ownership stake. The financial picture, from the outside, looked stable. But inside the executive offices, a different calculation was underway. The phrase that appeared in the business press, attributed to the company's own leadership, was devastating in its candor. Dominion Bridge needed to diversify beyond structural steel and escape the uncertainties associated with both the capital goods market and labor situation in Canada. Escape. Not address. Not adapt to. Escape. The man behind that calculation was Kenneth Barclay, then Vice President of Finance, soon to become the architect of the company's transformation and, ultimately, its destruction. Barclay looked at the Canadian operations, looked at the cyclical construction market, looked at the labor costs and the union contracts and the geographic realities of fabricating steel in a country of 23 million people spread across 4,000 miles, and concluded that the future was somewhere else. Businessweek profiled the company in September 1979 under the headline, "Dominion Bridge, Poised for a Big Buy." Forbes had already weighed in 2 years earlier, in November 1977, with a profile titled, "Crossing the Border." The business press understood exactly what was happening. The company that had built Canada's bridges was preparing to leave Canada. And the coverage framed it not as a tragedy, but as a strategy. In the late 1960s, at the very height of Dominion Bridge's national presence, with Expo 67 freshly completed and the Olympic contract ahead, the executive decision had already been made. The factory floor in Lachine had never been busier. The boardroom had already decided it didn't want to be Canadian anymore. The ironworkers on the Lachine floor didn't know it yet. They were fabricating steel for the Olympic Stadium, filling orders, driving rivets, welding joints, working overtime. The overhead crane was running. The cutting torches were lit. The familiar rhythm of the plant, the crash of pneumatic guns, the flash of arc welders, the grind of steel on steel, continued exactly as it had for 90 years. But the decisions that would end all of it had already begun. Chapter 7. Crossing the Border. Kenneth Barclay didn't arrive at the decision to leave Canada overnight. He arrived at it the way executives arrive at most transformative decisions, through a series of smaller calculations that accumulated into a conviction, and then through the discovery of a mentor who'd already done exactly what he was planning to do. The mentor's name was Royal Little. A decade earlier, Little had orchestrated one of the most celebrated corporate transformations in American business history, taking Textron, a New England textile company, and converting it through acquisition into a diversified conglomerate with almost no connection to its original industry. The textile mills were sold. The name was kept. The money went into aerospace, fasteners, financial services. By the time Barclay found him, Royal Little was regarded as the architect of the modern American conglomerate, and he was willing to share the playbook. Little's partner, Lon Kasler, began scouting acquisition targets for Dominion Bridge. The strategy was straightforward in concept and devastating in execution. Sell Canadian assets, use the proceeds to buy American companies, and transform a cyclical Canadian steel fabricator into a diversified industrial conglomerate with the majority of its operations and its growth south of the border. The first American acquisition came in 1971. Varco Pruden, Inc. of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a manufacturer of pre-engineered metal buildings with annual sales of $25 million. The purchase was made through a newly created U.S. subsidiary called Dombrico, Inc. The name was deliberately opaque. Nothing about Dombrico suggested Canada, or bridges, or a 100-year-old fabricating shop on the Lachine Canal. Then the pace accelerated. 1973, Priggen Steel Building Company of Massachusetts, Wiley Manufacturing, Clyde Iron Works, makers of Whirly cranes. All purchased through the U.S. subsidiary. Each acquisition moved money south. Each one required capital that came from the Canadian operations, from the plants that were still fabricating steel, still filling orders, still employing the workers whose paychecks funded the very strategy that was making their jobs less important with every passing quarter. In 1974, Barclay became CEO. He did not return the company's operational headquarters to Montreal. Instead, he set up shop in Hanover, New Hampshire, a college town on the Connecticut River, home to Dartmouth College, closer to Royal Little's New England orbit than to the Lachine Canal. The physical abandonment of Montreal was not announced as such. It simply happened. The CEO moved to New Hampshire, and the decisions followed him there. 1975 brought the shopping spree. Morgan Engineering of Ohio, Cherry Burrell, a food and dairy processing equipment manufacturer. Inslee Manufacturing of Indianapolis. DISA Industries of Chicago, chainsaws, power tools, excavating equipment. Each acquisition expanded the company's American footprint. Each one had nothing whatsoever to do with structural steel or bridges or the engineering tradition that had been built in Lachine over 93 years. The U.S. subsidiary was renamed AMCA International Corporation. Again, nothing in the name suggested Canada. The arithmetic of Barclay's strategy was simple and brutal. Between 1970 and 1978, Dominion Bridge purchased 12 American businesses. During the same period, it sold 10 major Canadian plants and properties, along with the company's $12 million interest in Canadian General Electric, all to raise the money for the American buying program. 10 Canadian plants sold to fund 12 American acquisitions. The Canadian industrial base, built over a century by thousands of workers, was being liquidated to finance a bet on American diversification. And the bet appeared to be working. Sales grew from $168 million in 1970 to $521 million in 1977 to $886 million in 1978. The numbers were dazzling. The growth was real. Forbes ran its profile, crossing the border, and the tone was admiring. Here was a Canadian company with the ambition to become a major American industrial player. The business press treated the strategy as a success story. What the business press didn't dwell on was what was being sold to make it happen. Every plant closure, every property sale, every divestiture of Canadian assets represented workers whose jobs had been eliminated, communities whose industrial anchor had been pulled up, and institutional knowledge that had taken decades to accumulate and could be dispersed in a single transaction. But those losses didn't appear in the sales figures that Forbes was celebrating. They appeared in the parking lots that emptied, the union halls that went quiet, and the towns that lost their largest employer without fanfare or ceremony. In 1978, Barclay made his largest acquisition yet. Amtel, a diversified steel products and energy services company with $250 million in annual sales, purchased for $80 million. It was the crown jewel of the American strategy, or at least the crown jewel so far. Barclay's stated goal was $5 billion in sales by 1989. He wasn't thinking about bridges anymore. He was thinking about empires. 1979 brought the near miss that should have been a warning. Dominion Bridge sold a fabricating facility in Quebec and raised $200 million in cash to bid for Warner and Swazi Company of Cleveland, a major American machine tool manufacturer. Bendix Corporation outbid them. The $200 million had been raised. The Canadian assets had been sold to raise it, and the target got away. The money was spent, the plants were gone, and Barclay had nothing to show for it but a war chest he'd already burned through. Canadian Pacific, meanwhile, had bought out Algoma Steel's 34.5% holding, bringing CP's stake in Dominion Bridge to just over 50%. The railway company that had given Dominion Bridge its first great contracts in the 1880s now held a controlling interest in what was rapidly becoming an American industrial conglomerate, funded by the liquidation of Canadian manufacturing capacity. The irony was exquisite, though nobody paused long enough to notice it. Chapter 8. The Billion-Dollar Vanishing Act. In 1981, Kenneth Barclay made the decision that erased the company's identity, Dominion Bridge Company, the name that had been stamped on structural steel for 99 years, the name associated with every major bridge and skyscraper frame in the country, the name that ironworkers in Lachine and Amherst and Winnipeg had carried on their hard hats and their paychecks and their pension statements for decades, was changed. The new name was AMCA International Ltd., a slight variation on the U.S. subsidiary's name. It meant nothing. It evoked nothing. It connected to nothing that any Canadian worker, customer, or community would recognize. The name Dominion Bridge was demoted to a subsidiary brand, still technically alive, still stamped on the steel that left the remaining Canadian plants, but no longer the identity of the company. A 99-year-old name replaced by an acronym that sounded like it had been generated by a committee that had been specifically instructed to produce something forgettable. The name change was presented as a simplification of the corporate structure. In reality, it was a signal. The company's identity was American now. The headquarters were in New Hampshire. The growth was in the United States. The Canadian operations, the plants that still fabricated steel, the workers who still drove rivets and welded joints, the bridges and buildings that still rose from Dominion bridge iron, were a legacy division inside a conglomerate that had decided its future lay elsewhere. 1 year later, Barclay made the decision that would destroy the company's finances. In 1982, AMCA International purchased Giddings and Lewis Inc., a Wisconsin machine tool manufacturer, for $310 million. At the time, Giddings and Lewis was the fifth largest machine tool company in its industry, with sales approaching $400 million. Barclay's 10-year plan called for $5 billion in sales by 1989. Giddings and Lewis was meant to be the acquisition that put the plan within reach. What Barclay couldn't have fully anticipated, though the warning signs were visible to anyone watching the American manufacturing sector, was that the entire U.S. machine tool industry was about to be decimated by German and Asian competition. Japanese manufacturers were producing machine tools at lower cost with equal or superior precision. German manufacturers held the high-end market. American firms, caught in the middle, collapsed. Giddings and Lewis collapsed with them. Between 1983 and 1987, AMCA International lost $285 million. The bulk of those losses came directly from the Giddings and Lewis write-down, the crown jewel that turned out to be made of glass. In 1987 alone, AMCA posted a net loss of $188 million on sales of $974 million. The company was selling nearly $1 billion worth of products and losing money at a rate that threatened its survival. $285 million. That was the cost of Barclay's American strategy, a figure made possible by the sale of 10 Canadian plants, the liquidation of Canadian assets, and the systematic transfer of wealth from a functioning industrial operation to a series of American acquisitions that, one after another, failed to deliver what was promised. The Canadian operations, starved of investment while the parent company hemorrhaged cash on American bets gone wrong, deteriorated further. The plants that remained received less capital, the equipment aged, the order books thinned, and the workers on the floor, who had no say in any of it, watched the slow degradation of facilities they'd maintained for decades. In 1986, William Holland took over as president and CEO. Barclay stayed as chairman. Holland's mandate was damage control. He embarked on what the press described as a mission to pare the company back down to its core engineering-related businesses, a restructuring of $500 million in assets, roughly 1/3 of the company's total. When he couldn't find a buyer for the construction products division, he shut it down entirely. The write-off wiped out 20% of AMCA's revenue for 1986. In 1989, Holland moved the headquarters again, from Hanover, New Hampshire, to Charlotte, North Carolina. Further south, further from Montreal, further from the canal, the fabricating shops, the workers, the history. The company that had been founded to build Canadian bridges was now headquartered in the American South, run by executives who had never set foot on the Lachine floor, producing products that had nothing to do with structural steel. 1990 brought another name change. AMCA International became United Dominion Industries. The word Dominion survived, a ghostly echo of the original name, preserved for whatever recognition value it still carried. But the company behind the name had nothing left of its original identity. Its focus was now niche industrial and building products, pumps, dock equipment, cooling towers, commercial doors. The structural steel fabrication that had built the nation's bridges and skyscrapers was a footnote in the annual report. And then came the sale. In 1994, William Holland and the United Dominion Industries Board sold an 85% stake in Dominion Bridge, the original four-plant Canadian subsidiary, comprising Lachine, Amherst, Winnipeg, and Edmonton, to the Cedar Group Inc. of Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. The price was less than $20 million. Less than $20 million. For an 85% stake in the company that had fabricated the steel for the Jacques Cartier Bridge, the Lions Gate Bridge, the Quebec Bridge, the Olympic Stadium, and the structural skeletons of half the skyscrapers in the country, the Wall Street Journal ran a single paragraph. Company agrees to sell 85% of Dominion Bridge Unit. One paragraph. For 112 years of Canadian industrial history. The buyer was Michel L. Marangera, and his Cedar Group was based in Conshohocken, a suburb of Philadelphia. The company that had built Canada's bridges was sold to a man from suburban Pennsylvania for less than the price of a good house in Westmount. In 1994 and 1995, Canadian Pacific divested its remaining holdings in United Dominion Industries. The last institutional connection to Canada was severed. The company founded to build Canadian Pacific Railway bridges had been orphaned from the railway, orphaned from the country, orphaned from everything except the name that still hung above the gates in Lachine, a name that now belonged to a speculator from Pennsylvania who had paid less than $20 million for the privilege of owning it. The workers at Lachine, many with 20 or 30 years of service, men who had spent their careers fabricating the steel that held up the country's infrastructure, woke up to discover their company had a new owner they'd never heard of, based in a place they'd never been, with intentions they could only guess at. They were assets on a spreadsheet. The transaction had been conducted between corporate entities in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Nobody had consulted the ironworkers. Nobody had consulted the welders, the crane operators, the men who knew the Lachine floor, the way a musician knows an instrument. The sale was a line item. The workers were inventory. Chapter 9. The Shipyard Gamble. For a few years after the Cedar Group purchase, the Lachine plant continued to operate. Marangera renamed his company Dominion Bridge Corporation, keeping the famous name alive, wrapping his new venture in a century of reputation that he'd acquired for less than the cost of a modest apartment building. The four plants, Lachine, Amherst, Winnipeg, Edmonton, were bundled under a subsidiary called Dominion Bridge, Inc. And for a brief period, the operation functioned. Steel was fabricated. Orders were filled. Workers with decades of service continued to arrive at the Lachine gates each morning, passing under a name that now belonged to someone else. But the financial foundation was fragile. The plants had been acquired cheaply because they needed investment, new equipment, upgraded facilities, the kind of capital expenditure that a century-old industrial operation requires simply to remain competitive. The Cedar Group was not a deep-pocketed industrial operator with the resources to modernize 4 aging steel fabrication plants. It was a speculator that had seen an opportunity to acquire a famous name and a functioning industrial base for a fraction of their replacement value. The gap between what the plants needed and what Marangera could provide was the crack in the foundation. The crack would widen. In 1996, the crack became a chasm. The Quebec provincial government had a problem. The Emile Davy Shipyard in Lausanne, Quebec, Canada's oldest and most illustrious shipyard, the yard that had built corvettes and frigates during the Second World War, was bankrupt. The federal and provincial governments had already poured $300 million in aid into Emile Davy by 1991. The shipyard was still bankrupt. The Quebec government wanted to save the yard and its jobs. It needed a buyer. Michel Marangera was willing. The Quebec government sold the bankrupt Emile Davy shipyard to Dominion Bridge Corporation for $1. $1 for a shipyard. The logic, such as it was, combined industrial ambition with political calculation. Marangera would build a diversified heavy engineering conglomerate, steel fabrication plus shipbuilding, and the Quebec government would have saved the shipyard without committing further public funds. Everyone would win. No one won. The shipyard was constructing 2 offshore drilling rigs for an international consortium. In 1998, the consortium defaulted on a $32 million payment. The money that Dominion Bridge Corporation had been counting on, the revenue that was supposed to justify the shipyard acquisition, that was supposed to generate the cash flow to keep both the shipyard and the steel fabrication plants running, vanished in a single contractual failure. Marangera went to the Quebec government. He asked for another aid package. The province, The same province that had sold him the shipyard for $1, the same province that had already spent $300 million trying to save Mile Davy, refused. The shipyard had consumed Dominion Bridge's cash reserves. The steel fabrication plants, already underfunded, had been starved further to cover the shipyard's losses. The $32 million default was the final blow, but it landed on a structure that was already hollow. In September 1998, Dominion Bridge Corporation entered bankruptcy protection. The company was 116 years old. It had been founded by an American engineer who saw a country waiting to be built. It had fabricated the steel for the nation's bridges, skyscrapers, dams, and Olympic stadiums. It had inadvertently created one of North America's most famous traditions of indigenous ironwork. It had survived the 1893 collapse of the Quebec Bridge approach spans, the 1907 catastrophe that killed 75 workers, 2 world wars, the Depression, the Quiet Revolution, the FLQ crisis, and the post-Olympic construction drought. It did not survive a $1 shipyard and a speculator from suburban Philadelphia. The Winnipeg plant ceased operations. Workers at Lachine, the men who had carried the smell of welding flux home on their clothes for 20, 25, 30 years, were laid off. Pensions that had been promised in exchange for decades of skilled, physically demanding work were destroyed or severely reduced. The bankruptcy didn't just eliminate jobs. It eliminated the financial security that those jobs had been supposed to provide in retirement, the deferred compensation that workers had accepted in place of higher wages, the promise that the years on the fabricating floor would be repaid in dignity when the work was done. That promise was broken. Later in 1998, the partial rescue came. Group ADF Inc., a structural steel company from Terrebonne, Quebec, purchased the assets of the Lachine plant. Operations restarted under a new name, ADF Industries Lourdes. Workers who had been laid off were rehired, many of them men who had worked at the plant for over 20 years. They returned to the same floor, the same bays, the same overhead crane. But the name above the gate was different. The institutional memory, the corporate history, the connection to a century of fabrication, gone. They were doing the same work, in the same place, for a company that had no connection to the one that had taught them their trade. In 2003, ADF threatened to close the Lachine facility. Syntube, a company specializing in precision bending of tubes, pipes, beams, and channels that had been a Dominion Bridge partner, purchased the assets. Another transaction, another change of name, another chapter in the slow dismemberment of what had once been a single, coherent industrial operation stretching from the Maritimes to the Pacific. And what of the corporate entity that had sold Dominion Bridge in the first place? United Dominion Industries, the company that had shed its Canadian identity, moved to Charlotte, and focused on pumps and cooling towers and commercial doors, continued to prosper. In March 2001, SPX Corporation of Charlotte, North Carolina, acquired United Dominion Industries for $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion. The corporate descendant of Dominion Bridge was worth $1.8 billion. But the actual Dominion Bridge, the fabricating shops, the skilled workers, the century of institutional knowledge, had been sold for less than $20 million and driven into bankruptcy by a $1 shipyard. The value had been extracted, renamed, and relocated. The shell company was worth a fortune. The real company was dead. The corporate lineage told the whole story in 5 names. Toronto Bridge, 1879. Dominion Bridge, 1882. AMCA International, 1981. United Dominion Industries, 1990. SPX Corporation, 2001. 5 names in 119 years. Each one a further step away from the riveting shop in Lachine. Chapter 10. The Eco District. The 12-hectare Lachine site sits on contaminated soil. More than a century of steel fabrication, the cutting torches, the welding flux, the machine oil, the accumulated byproducts of industrial production at scale, left the ground poisoned. Before anything new could be built, the land had to be cleaned. Soil remediation, environmental assessment, the literal work of scrubbing the earth of what industry left behind. The redevelopment plan, designed by LeMay Architects, calls for 1,900 dwellings, 12,000 square meters of commercial space, and 25,000 square meters of recreational and public areas. An eco-district, dense, sustainable, mixed use. The kind of development that urban planners describe with words like vibrant and walkable and connected. The Ville de Montréal has designated the area a sector of exceptional heritage value. Heritage elements survive in the landscape plan. The overhead crane, the pont roulant that once ran on rails above the fabricating floor, lifting multi-ton steel members with the precision of a watchmaker, stands preserved as what the planners call a heritage witness. Salvaged roof trusses and building fragments have been incorporated as design elements. Railway lines are recalled in wood decking for pedestrian pathways. A triangle motif runs throughout the plan, the shape of a truss, embedded in sidewalks and landscaping, the last geometric echo of what was fabricated on this ground for over 100 years. The Lachine Canal itself, once choked with industrial traffic, with barges hauling raw steel to the Dominion Bridge sidings and finished structural members heading out to construction sites across the country, is now a national historic site. Cycling paths line the banks. Recreational boats drift past in summer. Condominiums rise where sawmills and iron shops once stood. The water is cleaner than it's been in a century. The silence is deeper too. 3,000 kilometers to the west, the Burnaby plant has had a different afterlife. The 15-acre site where steel trusses were riveted from 1930 to the mid-1970s became Bridge Studios in 1987. It now operates the largest effects stage in North America. Over 1,000 productions have been filmed there since the conversion. MacGyver, Stargate SG-1, Stargate Atlantis, Once Upon a Time, Legends of the Fall, First Blood. The studio is expanding to 34 sound stages. The old steel fabrication plant reborn as the infrastructure of a different kind of Canadian industry. The name persists. Bridge Studios. Almost nobody who works there knows why it's called that. The bridge in the name is Dominion Bridge, the company that built the plant, the company whose workers fabricated steel trusses on the same concrete floor where actors now perform in front of green screens. The name is a ghost. It means something. It refers to something. But the connection between the word and the history has faded to the point where it's essentially invisible. A piece of industrial archaeology embedded in a movie studio logo. The workers who were rehired by ADF in 1998 continued for a time on the Lachine floor. Some of them had worked there for more than 20 years. They knew the plant the way you know a house you've lived in your whole life. Not just the layout, but the sounds, the rhythms, the way the light fell through the clear-story windows at different times of day, the places where the floor was worn smooth by decades of boots. They carried that knowledge with them, and they applied it under a new name, for a new company, on the same ground. But institutional knowledge is fragile. It lives in people, not in buildings. And when the last of those workers retired, the knowledge of what Dominion Bridge had been, how the work was done, how the problems were solved, how the steel was shaped and assembled by hands that had learned from other hands stretching back to 1883, went with them. The pensions that were destroyed in the 1998 bankruptcy were never restored. Workers who had spent 20 and 30 years on the Lachine floor, who had accepted the physical demands of the trade, the noise, the cold, the risk, in exchange for a promise that the company would provide for them in retirement, discovered that the promise had been broken by men they'd never met, in transactions they'd never been consulted about, for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of their work or the value of what they produced. The steel they fabricated still carries traffic. The bridges still stand. The pension checks stopped. The structures remain. The Jacques Cartier Bridge carries 35 million vehicles a year. The Lionsgate Bridge still spans the Narrows. The Quebec Bridge still carries trains across the St. Lawrence, 108 years after Dominion Bridge's engineers completed the world's longest cantilever on the third attempt, after 88 men had died making it possible. The Olympic Stadium still stands, its retractable roof a monument to the ambitions of 1976. The Alexandra Bridge still connects Ottawa to Gatineau, just as it has since 1901, when George Herrick Duggan's engineering department designed and built the fourth longest cantilever span in the world. Every one of those structures was fabricated in a shop that no longer exists by workers whose pensions were destroyed. The Kanawaki Mohawk ironworker tradition continues. Mohawk ironworkers helped build the new Champlain Bridge, working the high steel in Montreal, as their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had done since 1886, when a Dominion Bridge foreman assumed the Mohawk men would carry boxes, and the Mohawk men climbed into the sky instead. The tradition outlasted the company that started it. It will outlast most things. And the Lachine site in winter, snow falling on remediated soil where the fabricating shop stood for 115 years. The overhead crane preserved in the landscape, motionless, dusted with white, its cable frozen, its purpose completed. The canal at the edge of the site, ice forming along the banks where barges once loaded steel for delivery across the country. The quiet. A company that built the physical structure of a nation was dismantled not by foreign competition, not by technological change, not by free trade, but by its own management, who decided Canada was too small and the money was better spent somewhere else. They were right, in a way. United Dominion Industries was worth $1.8 billion when SPX bought it. The spreadsheet justified every decision. The money did go somewhere else, and it multiplied. But the thing that made the name mean something, the riveting, the welding, the steel shaped in Lachine and erected across the country, that was gone. The bridges remain. The company that built them doesn't. The ironworkers' tradition continues. The ironworkers' pensions don't. The crane stands in the snow. It lifts nothing. The canal is still.